all aspects of a person's life are good. All aspects of a person's life is going to include things like suffering, happiness, pleasure. It's going to include things like pain. What we're doing here is we're trying to understand what makes life worth living.
Harvard researchers and their collaborators have been asking one of the most important questions of our time. What does it actually mean for humans to flourish? Not just to succeed, not just to be happy, but to truly flourish across multiple dimensions of life. And what they're finding is challenging maybe some of our deepest assumptions. When they surveyed over 200,000 people across 22 countries, they found that the wealthiest, most economically developed nations were actually scoring lower on things like meaning, relationships, and character, while other nations were quietly leading on dimensions that matter most for a good life. This research is still unfolding, but what's already emerging is asking us to seriously rethink what flourishing actually looks like and what leads to its actualization. Welcome to the Building Thinkers podcast. Today, I'm joined by someone whose entire focus is taking what Harvard's Human Flourishing Program is learning and translating it into something that people and organizations can actually use, impact across business, education policy, and beyond. We're going to get into what flourishing actually means, how researchers even begin to measure something that's that expansive, and what the early findings mean for how we live our lives. Before this work, my guest spent time along Arthur Brooks at the Harvard Kennedy School, launching the Leadership and Happiness Laboratory. So he brings both the research rigor and the real-world application lens that I think is going to make such a rich conversation. So without further ado, I'm so excited to be joined by
Reece Brown.
Okay, Reece, I saw something in your background that I want to start with because it's the Building Thinkers podcast. I often ask this opening question of like, what is it that you build? How did you get here? And I saw like one little line in your bio says you started in investment analysis. So I want to know what brought you from investments into flourishing. And I saw the happiness lab. Like, how'd you get from finance to joy?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, in fact, there's hope for all of you still stuck in finance. Just want to let you know. No, truly, thank you. It is a bit of a circumnavigating career path that I've had, it hasn't been all that long. But I went to a liberal arts college, and I think that's a big piece of it. I grew up in a house where my dad, I love him so much, and every single morning he wakes up before the sun and he's got a book and he's always reading, history, philosophy, theology, one thing or another. My parents were always listening things on tape. And so I just was, always had curiosity about the world. And so when I went to college, I studied economics. And in fact, actually was there where I first encountered this guy named Arthur Brooks. Read some of his stuff on free enterprise and how capitalism he was at the American Enterprise Institute. And so he was interested in how capitalism was actually a tool for good, could help people with self-actualization, raise people out of poverty internationally. So that's where I first read about this guy. But I went into, I needed a good practical job. I had great vision for my life, but I went into investment analysis. I was working on an investment team, trading stocks and bonds. I was on a Bloomberg terminal. Wonderful job. In fact, actually, my CIO at the time taught me a lot about research and the scrupulosity at which you need to do research. In fact, actually, learning to bet money on the research you do is very important. And in fact, actually, I think a lot of people in a university context or in a self-help context could benefit from actually having to put money where their mouth is. So that's where I sort of learned all this. But I was my best friend was going to the Harvard Law School, and he said, "Hey, Reece, you'll never guess what happened." Like, what are you talking about? Arthur Brooks came to Harvard. I'm like, no kidding. And he said, "And did you know he's hiring?" And so honestly, that's where the rest is history sort of turn happens. I applied for the job, not knowing Arthur Brooks from anyone else in the world, and he gave it to me. Took a chance. I started as his research assistant, sort of had this informal postdoc experience, doing research memos for columns and articles and books and classes, and we built a lot of fun stuff together. We started a teaching laboratory for MBA and Masters of Public Policy students, so got to work with students, went and met the Dalai Lama a few times. We got to do some really cool things, internationally. So just what an experience. Love Arthur. And then since then, have adopted more of a slightly more strategic, I would say, role of the Human Flourishing Program. So I now working with the team here, led by Dr. Tyler Vanderweel. And my main job is exactly as you said. It's to focus on how can we take research and make it impactful in the world.
That is amazing. I love hearing people's windy career paths. And to your point, it's just beginning. So, where I'd love to go from here, Reece, is setting some of the groundwork. I'm not going to assume that all of our listeners know what the flourishing study is, but I want to start with what is flourishing. So, kind of defining the territory before we go further, the program that we're going to talk about, what's the definition of flourishing? Let's start there.
Absolutely. I think people are a lot more familiar than they realize with the idea of human flourishing, but they've probably come to it with slightly different terminology. So it sort of depends on the thing you want to ask about. A lot of people ask, what's the difference between happiness and flourishing? What's the difference between joy and happiness? What's the difference between well-being and flourishing? And in general, I would say that, human flourishing is probably one of the bigger lenses. Well-being and human flourishing is probably the most expansive view. And so when we talk about human flourishing, we're really talking about a theory of what it means to be human, what it means to be a person. Mm-hmm. And that theory is, and how we define human flourishing is a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. So clearly, all aspects of a person's life is going to include things like suffering. It's going to include things like happiness. It's going to include things like pleasure. It's going to include things like pain. So when we take the broadest level, that's human flourishing. We define human flourishing based on 5 domains. This is some seminal research that was done by our director, Tyler Vanderweel, in a paper that he published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2017. And in it, he essentially looked at, and we've found this to be true in a lot of different studies now, you look at the things that are most universally desired and good in and of themselves. And what are those things that are common across every culture, people group? And those tend to be 5 domains: happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, close social relationships. And then there's a 6th that we don't include in this framework, but is also essential, which is financial security. So you take that perspective, then you're going to start thinking, okay, wow, what's underneath each one of those things? And you can start to see how this becomes like this big mess. It becomes this huge, like, oh my gosh, there's a million, Russian nesting dolls. And how do we know what's what? Ultimately, there's this wonderful definition that comes from one of the founders of positive psychology, Christopher Peterson. He said, ultimately, positive psychology, or what we're doing here, is we're trying to understand what makes life worth living. So that's what we're really trying to get to the bottom of. What makes life worth living? We can organize it in all these different ways, but that's the essential question.
Reece, that's so powerful. Before we started recording, we were kind of talking about which direction where we're headed. And, I'm really thinking about those different domains, those different areas. And one of the things that I said was, I think that this question of flourishing is under like all the self-help books, all the reasons why somebody might click on a podcast is, and sometimes it's, to your point, one of the Russian nesting dolls that's at the bottom, like how do I maximize my 401k, like underneath the finance side, or how do I have a better conversation with my partner, or whatever that might be, or how do I parent my middle schooler, relevant right now. But they're all, how do we live a flourishing life? How do we live a life worth living? And so where I'd like to go from here is a little bit into the measurement. We don't need to get into all of the research details of it, but I am curious how you started to measure something that's this expansive. Did you go into, for example, those 5 domains and there's sub items underneath that? Can you talk to us a little bit more about that? Because I think understanding the things that comprise each of those domains does help people take action in their lives.
Yeah. Before I go there, I'll make one quick little note about sort of the most expansive view. If you take sort of the shadow of human flourishing, what's the shadow? What is the thing that's bringing people to this? Because you mentioned self-help literature. Yeah. What causes a person to come to the Human Flourishing Program page and look for research? What causes a person to go to Amazon and buy the latest self-help book from a popular podcaster? Typically, there is a certain amount of dissatisfaction. And here's where we're going to kind of come into the happiness sort of domain and pillar a little bit, which is one of the most vexing problems for happiness or life satisfaction in general is the satisfaction dilemma, which is that we have what's called hedonic adaptation. We adapt to our emotional experiences, to our life experiences, to our level of income and happiness all the time. And so being satisfied with our life, our condition of life, is very difficult. It's like always walking on a treadmill and there's just always a carrot out in front of you. And this is particularly difficult in societies where, we're comparing ourselves to each other all the time and we're trying to, do well financially and in a worldly way. So I'd say, generally speaking, that's one of the biggest reasons people come to this. What I typically talk about as the fundamental problem is in all of well-being, because that's like the happiness thing. What about, mental health? There's all sorts of, things we could talk about with psychosis. We could talk about all of the different, reasons people come to this. And what I'm typically trying to narrow in on is some kind of, aspect of being stuck. People feel stuck. They feel that they are trapped, maybe. That might be a little bit more existential of a question, but they're trying to go from here to there. They're trying to break out and break into more human flourishing. And you can measure that. And there's a lot of research that would sort of diagnose that. But I would say that that's sort of if we're all looking for happiness, we're all looking for human flourishing, it's coming because we have this sense of feeling stuck or that we want more progress. And so I think that's sort of the shadow that we're addressing in a lot of ways. That could be a sense of meaninglessness, you need more meaning in life, or you want to connect to God and spirituality and people. There's a lot there. We talk about loneliness. So that's kind of the fundamental thread across it all.
Reece, I'm so glad you brought us to that, because a couple things there, maybe before we go further, like this idea of wanting more progress. I think that's one of the ones I hear from listeners and friends, and to your point of kind of the hedonistic trap of like, okay, so now I've made it to this next tax bracket or whatever. Now there's new things that are around the corner. I fixed my floors, but now I need to update my fence, or I update my car, or, whatever those things are that I had a guest come on one time and he said, it's the happy when-itis. I'll be happy when. And it's always around the corner. It's always that next thing. And to your point, the comparison, depending on where you live, who's around you. And I'm interested, maybe down the road, we can come back to why finance is outside of the other. I have a hypothesis on why finance is outside of the others, but that might be interesting to get into. So as we are thinking about the measurement and the domains and what brought people to this, can you walk us through a little bit more about how it does start to get measured, and then maybe into some of the findings we can go from there?
Right. Absolutely. So the measurement is fun and interesting. I think the place to start is essentially at the base of all research, generally speaking, in psychology, clinical psychology, and sort of epidemiology. So if we're looking at individuals and we're trying to get a sense of the individual person's happiness, we're going to look at like some measures of clinical psychology. We might take a happiness index. We might take, Beck's depression inventory. If we're looking at a population level, we're going to take a more epidemiological approach, which is that's the human flourishing measure, is very much oriented toward the collective and a community. But at the base is the study of psychometrics, which is the art, the craft, and the science of coming up with questions that measure specific items. So in this model, in this theory of the human person of human flourishing, we have the 12-item secure flourishing measure, which is 12 questions oriented around these 6 domains we talked about, which all measure, based on an individual's response, the level of life satisfaction or life evaluation that person experiences relative to that item. So it's essentially, meaning and purpose. How much meaning and purpose do you feel that you're experiencing? Or these are not the questions, for the record. We can link out to all of them. You can find that survey. But every item is meant to track a trait. So we talked about those Russian nesting dolls. At the very, very bottom of every single one of those, we're going to talk about, how do we want to measure engagement? We want to measure meaning. We want to measure purpose. Like all of these very important traits that we know so much about, we have questions around those. So that's ultimately the question of how we measure it. What happens is that the difference between the me and the we is quite vast. So when we're talking about an individual, what makes an individual happy is very different from what makes an individual thrive or flourish embedded in a community. And so when we're trying to focus on the question of human flourishing at a country and national level. It's very different from an individual level. So this might be part of why you start to see in our Global Flourishing Study, which I think we'll talk about, that we released, that the first wave was released this last year. We came up with a slightly different list of countries in terms of composite flourishing than the World Happiness Report has. But the World Happiness Report asks a single item to individuals. We're asking dozens and dozens, in fact, actually over 100 questions to an individual, and we're taking that composite score as a collective, and that's how we're sort of looking at. So I think when you're measuring these things, ultimately what you do is you're asking questions, individuals responding back. If we want to get really wonky, we can talk about all the problems with that. But that's sort of the approach. That's how you get started measuring these things.
I want to talk about the word trait that you used when you said you're getting down to measuring that trait. Are you using the word trait to mean like a characteristic that we could then see in individuals, or can you just walk me through a little bit more of that piece? I know this is getting into the weeds, but I think it's interesting, again, to connect for people.
I use that term slightly more colloquially than scientists in psychology will. By trait, I am referring to something like grit or resilience or gratitude. Very specific socio-emotional experiences that an individual expresses through their behavior or experiences in behavior. And at the bottom, there's a lot of debate over whether traits are static, whether they can be influenced. I think it's pretty clear. I mean, the research is emerging. I'm not an expert in that. But let's take, for an example, the idea of grit, which Angela Duckworth has popularized and people are quite familiar with. It's the idea of how dedicated are you to your goals? Essentially, this is slightly different from resilience, but it's in the face of setbacks or adversity. Can you push through and achieve those goals? That's grit. That's grittiness. And so if we're going to ask, like, is a person flourishing in life? Well, it's like, well, there's 24 different character traits that we measure. There's like 100 different, traits that show up in an individual's life. So when we look at this population level, when we're approaching the human being as a theory, this is why you'll find that the human flourishing measure is a little bit bigger. The questions that we ask are a little bit more focused on these domains of what's your quality of life related to financial security? Because we know it's really, really important. But we're not necessarily going to ask, are you good at paying your bills on time? And does that, relate to the virtue of prudence? You know what I mean? So I think there's a lot that we know about these traits. But when we're sort of taking this whole person perspective, we go a few orders higher so that we get a full picture of the person.
Okay. And I think I realized I wasn't exactly sure why my curiosity took me there until you started to explain it. But I think it's because I was trying to get at, like, are these traits mindsets, behaviors? Can they be taught? Are they competencies? And so I was hearing a little bit more in that from what you said when you just said, like, paying your bills connected to prudence. Because when we think about the impact of the research itself, I think in those two places of education policy as a system, as a whole, health policy, and then I also think about the individuals of how people might access the research. So I think that's where the curiosity came from. I don't know if you want to say any more about that. Yeah.
Well, I will just say before we move on, absolutely. You can study traits and you can teach them and you can improve them. And we know a lot about neuroplasticity now. You can change as a person. So, I think it's just the question that you're asking and the problem that you're solving for. Are you a parent or a coach or a teacher who is trying to promote a trait within, a student or a child? Or are you a leader of a country or a corporation who is trying to improve, the lived experience of a community or a country at a population level? It's going to be very different, obviously, but fortunately, we're getting to a place in the world where we have quite a bit of research that tells us how to influence both of those kinds of problems.
Okay, Reece, maybe you can take us now into like the current kind of status of the program and study. I know there's offshoots and things like that. Can you set the stage for where the study is currently and maybe some of the findings that have been most powerful to you as you look across the research?
Well, thank you. This is an exciting part of what I get to do is to promote the Human Flourishing Program. The Human Flourishing Program was founded in 2016, so it's not particularly old, but we're coming around on our 10-year birthday. The most significant thing that's come out of the program to date has been the launch and the release of the Global Flourishing Study. So several years ago, thanks to some fantastic donors. This is a monumental project, and so it took, this is a millions and millions of dollars to pull off. But Tyler Vanderwill and Byron Johnson, Tyler's here at Harvard, Byron's at Baylor University in Texas, and through their vision and leadership, we were able to conduct a longitudinal global study of human flourishing, which means that we have over 220,000 individuals in the study, which means by magnitude is one of the largest that's ever been conducted in the world. It has 22 countries involved in the study, which again, by number means it's the largest in terms of country listings. And it's longitudinal, which is very unique and is very important in terms of what we can know based on causality in terms of the scientific rigor. So if you want to study, happiness or well-being or any of these traits, and I were to take a picture, of you as an individual engaging in said trait, whether it be giving, perhaps you help, the proverbial sort of example, help an old lady cross the road. I could take a picture of you doing that, but I wouldn't know if that's really a part of your life unless I have a movie. And so to use the most reductionistic sort of terms possible, a longitudinal study is watching the movie of an individual's life. And it means that we can know if we collect data in year 1, data in year 2, data in year 3, and year 4. We have a 5-wave study, by the way. We'll be able to see those changes. And those changes are really important based on what we know to be causal. So, all sorts of things can happen in an individual's life from year 1 to year 2. But if you ask the same question and you don't have, let's say, did you buy a house this year? And then and the next year you're homeless. We don't ask you a dozen questions around, your quality of life. We won't necessarily know why or what caused the change. And so this is the biggest thing that's been done today at the Flourishing Program. We're very proud that it's monumental in the field because there are extraordinary studies, like the Harvard study of adult development that have studied individuals over time. There are studies in Europe that have done the same thing. Phenomenal. But to our knowledge, no one's done this at a global scale. And I'm not just saying to our knowledge, I'm being humble. No one's done this. So we're really excited about that.
You can say it. You've done it.
Yeah, it's
a big
huge.
Deal. It's okay.
It's a big deal. We're in partnership with Gallup on this, as you can imagine. It takes extraordinary resources and manpower and money to ask 220,000 people over 100 questions. So we're out in the field, and that's difficult. But the initial responses and the emerging sort of observations from the Global Flourishing Study are pretty astounding. Before I go on to the rest of the program, I'll share a few high level, which is that one of the things that we know on a relatively universal basis from an individual's lived experience is that happiness and the experience of happiness or well-being tends to look a lot like a U shape throughout a person's life. Meaning if you imagine, an XY chart in your head, it starts out pretty high in young age and then bottoms out. In fact, I think that the global average is around 47.2 years of age. And this was work that was done by Danny Blanchflower at Dartmouth. He's a great economist. And then it starts to go back up. And there's all sorts of reasons it goes back up. It could be that you have to work less. You get to spend more time with your, husband, wife, romantic partner, spouse, etc. It could be that the kids are out of the house. There's dozens of reasons. But generally, that's been the trend. What we found in the Global Flourishing Study, and this is quite alarming and matches a lot of what you've heard in society in general, is that young people's happiness has gone down. And so as a general, sort of arc, it looks a lot more like a J curve than it does a U curve. So that flattening has happened. That's been compressed in young life, and then it goes up in later life. That's the first thing that was huge. And again, like I said, it tracks with a lot of what you've heard. Jonathan Haidt and the Anxious Generation and all sorts of his work is showing how social media and other things in society are causing the lived experience of well-being and happiness of young people to go down. Vivek Murthy, the prior Surgeon General, has shared a lot about the loneliness epidemic, but in particular how it's affecting young people, and young people are feeling a lot less meaning and purpose. So that's the big thing. The second thing I think that has been most interesting is that countries are flourishing in different ways. Yeah. The World Happiness Report, we love the folks over at Oxford, led by Jan Emmanuel Deneuve. Great colleagues, wonderful people, and they've tracked happiness on a level that has really stayed consistent, mostly in the Nordic countries. also in what we call weird countries. The acronym is Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic. These weird countries
Love
tend to do
acronyms.
really well in the World Happiness Report. But we got the most unexpected result because we just didn't expect it. Not that there's any, not casting any aspersions, but Indonesia came out with the top composite flourishing score in our study. And that's mostly because, there's trade-offs. There's all sorts of trade-offs that are contributing to people's happiness and flourishing in different ways. And then the last one I'll share before, I'll let you interject or we can move on, is that there's a really strong causal predictor between young children's experience of religious service attendance and later life flourishing. And this was something that we didn't necessarily go looking for, but asking a lot of questions about childhood experience and then your lived experience or present experience, there was a strong correlation and predictive sort of measure around whether a young person had attended religious service. What's really fun about this is that, it was consistent across all religions. So whether it was Islam, Buddhism, Christianity, or others, especially the major religions, it was all consistent. And so to us, that's pretty remarkable. It's like, wow, pay attention to this. So that's sort of the big snapshot of Global Flourishing Study. There's much more,
Wow.
of course.
I only have 10 million questions, but let me narrow them down. First of all, on the youth question that you talked about, the youth, young people finding, was that across the globe? Did that,
right?
Or was that, okay?
There's variation, but that was again, like sort of this big New York Times breaking news finding, is that globally speaking, that compression was universal.
Right. And so in theory, not only in places that might have a smartphone in your hand, but in other places where that might not be in their hand.
Right.
Interesting. Okay, on the trade-offs, can we talk more about the trade-offs? Because I'm interested in unpacking what insights there may be on why Indonesia rose to the top and other countries, my understanding is, that were right underneath that similarly. Talk more about the trade-offs and how we might think about that. And it can also be too, like, I know we've talked a lot about the individual level, but there's also, listeners that are running systems, that are leaders, that are in the education space of policy or health policy. So curious just about any of your thoughts on those trade-offs that you were referencing.
Yeah. And I might go out a little over my skis here because I would say, I've got several colleagues who probably should take the mic at this point. But I will say some of the things that we do know is that there are some trade-offs around financial security, for example. There's a lot of variation across the domains. So in some contexts, certainly not all, suffering and adversity in childhood can sometimes subsequently lead to greater resilience or meaning or pro-social orientation. And so you would think that, a Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic country with strong financial security might be doing higher meaning and purpose. Who knows? I don't know what one's assumption is, but there's a trade-off as an example, is that I'm not necessarily suggesting that you go looking for adversity. It will find you, but it's one of the reasons that you're sort of seeing a scattering across and a mixing across these, what you might otherwise call rankings. Another example is of Japan. So Japan is doing really poorly, surprisingly poorly, with the lowest average scores in the Global Flourishing Study for many aspects of flourishing. And then again, on the other hand, Japan has historically over the last few decades been a strong economic power. So some of the stuff that we know before conducting this study, we knew already that Japan has an alarming aging population, that their fertility rates are lower. There's less nuclear families, one might say. I'm not necessarily attributing their composite score to that, but that was another sort of trade-off. It's like, okay, this is showing up fairly clearly, not necessarily sure exactly why. Wait for wave 2 and 3.
I hear more money, more problems.
yeah, maybe that may be. So yeah, those are a few sort of the trade-offs I might point to in general.
Yeah, one of the things when you were talking about suffering in childhood, adversity, it reminds me of Paul Tufts' How Children Succeed and some of the research that he had within there. I joke with my boys sometimes. I'm like, you need to go to toughness camp or adversity camp or something to have some of these skills, or like we need to do sports in a different way, mostly in jest, but I have seen the connections there. And then even thinking about my own windy career path and some of the things that brought me to what I'm doing, and how I learned that. And so,
I don't think it's a joke, by the way. It is
yeah,
funny. It
okay.
is funny, but the
Yeah,
research, what the research would say is that, Tracy, you're exactly right. In fact, actually, Jonathan Haidt's work is excellent on this. Is that the sort of safetyism and the helicopter parenting that the last few generations has experienced has been net harmful to childhood development.
right.
He has a question that he asks a lot in different research projects and in popular audiences, which is, what was the first age at which you were allowed to, go down the street or visit a friend, or, go to the grocery store, or ride your bike into town without a parent and without a cell phone? And today's answers are completely different. I grew up in, the woods of the Pacific Northwest. And so I was, going on hikes by myself and, trying to catch squirrels when I was like 6 and 7, 8 years old. And now kids aren't really allowed out of the house unless they have a cell phone. So that is important. So I'd say, it's a good joke. I joke about it too, to go to Tuft Camp, but that might actually be an important intervention, is to actually introduce some toughness into life.
This may be a business opportunity for somebody out there. Tough camp. Reece, another one of the findings that you brought up that was maybe surprising or you didn't go looking for was this spiritual dimension. And I'm curious, how has the program been thinking about this finding? And I'm struck especially by like living in such a secular world that often like leaves that dimension kind of out or to the side. How is that being spoken about from the research angle?
Well, generally speaking, the way that we make sense of this tends to be that the questions of meaning and purpose are universal. One might think of Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, that we have we talked about earlier, the sort of shadow of human flourishing being that desire for breakthrough, that craving for more. People crave to understand who they are in light of the universe, to make sense of their story. And so when we ask questions of meaning and purpose, generally speaking, people who have a religious community have more answers to those questions, either because, there's a framework for it that's been introduced by the religious community. And so that's a big piece of it, is that oftentimes it just gives you more of an articulation for that. We will say that we're fairly agnostic in terms of, what this means for individuals. I would say, more spirituality in general for sure is going to be helpful to you. But we're not necessarily saying that it is Christianity, it is, Buddhism, whatnot. And I think that's important. But I think that is typically the distinction. There's a lot of really strong research on the individualized side, which is that having a stronger sense of meaning and purpose does, in fact, actually reduce depressive symptomology. It will, in weird ways, cause you to live longer. There's really fun, really interesting aspects of these protective elements around having a sense of meaning and purpose in life, protective of relationships. It can be more predictive of one's ability to reduce conflict. It's nuanced for sure. But at the bottom of it, and this is one thing that I really appreciate about my old boss and professor, Arthur Brooks, is says, look, what you need to do is essentially ask two questions, which is, why am I here? What's the answer to that? Why am I here on this earth? And your answer might be because, well, God made me. And it might be, well, because my parents made me and there's no God. But you need to have some sense of like, why am I here? What's my purpose in life? And what am I willing to die for? What are my ultimate values? And I think that typically religious people have answers to those questions because they've started to discern them. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't find them without religion. I'm a huge fan of Ryan Holiday's, and I think that the Stoicism work is really excellent on this point. And you do get a percentage of the benefit. I'm not going to say which percentage. There's a good debate going on right now about this, but you get a percentage of the meaning and purpose benefits of having a spirituality practice, if that's Stoicism, that isn't necessarily organized religion.
Interesting. Like, yeah, I was thinking of other potential, contributing factors to that. One being perhaps community and it to
Hmm.
combat the loneliness side that typically in a spiritual community of practice, there would be other people. And so you might have the
Hmm.
tradition of meeting with them. I also was thinking, I originally wrote down rules, but I want to adjust that term to be like ways and rhythms of life that are connected to spiritual practice, no matter the religion or even within something like Stoicism. And I was thinking of practices like prayer, meditation, mindfulness, the different ways that that relates. But then there's also these kind of rhythms and practices that may often be categorized as moral, or like we do or don't do things because of our religious practice. And that got me thinking all sorts of other potential contributing factors too, like whether like how we view alcohol, how we view other
Hmm.
things that might connect to flourishing. As an
Yeah.
aside, I could have been a researcher. I could investigate all these.
You could. Yeah, no, there's a lot there.
Yeah, more things that can be explored over time. And then, can you speak to Reece? My understanding is there's other offshoots perhaps of this work. I think there's one that's focused specifically on the spiritual aspect and other. How are folks kind of collaborating within the project, and what's maybe the end goal of collecting the data and the connection points for people in policy and individuals?
Well, back to your point about sort of religious community in general. So a huge happiness or well-being or flourishing boost that people with religious community get is the pro-social
Mhm.
elements of that. And so, we joke with our friends that, they have a hobby, it turns into a club, and the club turns into a cult. And that's actually a real thing.
Yeah.
In fact, I am a marathon runner. I like to run alone,
Mhm.
but I am somewhat baffled by the sort of allegiance to things like CrossFit and high rocks and spin classes. Like, people genuinely, and I think that you're seeing this out of COVID, people are genuinely looking for community. And that kind of brings me to one of the values of the Human Flourishing Program, value contributions to society, and part of the dovetails into the rest of the work that we do, is that the Flourishing Program is very interested, and this is somewhat unique of our institution compared to others, is that we're very interested in the flourishing of the individual as embedded in community and as attached to community outside of themselves. And again, that sort of goes back to that big distinction we're making between the me and the we, the sort of science for the individual and the science for the collective. And so some of the other projects that we work on, I would say one of the really fascinating things that might go back to sort of a moral practice, or something that you can derive a lot of flourishing out of that isn't necessarily religious, is the work of forgiveness. So
Mm.
I'm about to list like a dozen projects, but one of the things that's really fun and remarkable about the Human Flourishing Program is some of the work that we've done around forgiveness. So this was established, I don't know, like a decade or two ago by a pioneering psychologist by the name of Everett Worthington. And he started to look, forgiveness is a transformative experience, but can we study this psychologically? Can we actually get it in the laboratory? And the answer to that was, well, yes, but Tyler Vanderweel appeared on the scene. Richard Cowden here at the program. There's been a lot of work funded by the Templeton Foundation that has really looked at what are the treatment and control effects of a forgiveness intervention. One of the things that we have at the program, and I would encourage people to look at this, you go on our forgiveness page, you can download for free of cost, a forgiveness workbook. Now, this doesn't necessarily, you do not need to be in a hostile conflict to benefit from this, right? It could be an old grudge. It could be something that's a low grade sort of disagreement you have with another individual. But I encourage people to walk through this because this workbook was actually developed off of cognitive behavioral therapy practices. We did testing with groups to actually make sure that this thing worked. We did pre and post survey assessments. And it turns out that just this simple workbook of leading people through forgiveness, which forgiveness, by the way, the definition of it is replacing ill will toward an offender or someone with goodwill. So there's an actual transformation. We're not just talking about peace. We're not talking about justice. We're not talking about but if you are actually feeling, you want to punch somebody in the face, and how do you take that feeling and transform it into, I want to shake your hand and invite you into, my world for dinner, right? Like that is a remarkable thing in terms of like what we can do with trauma, what we can do with conflict, what we can do within relationships is super unique to the program. And again, that's the science of we. That's the science of how do I improve flourishing beyond myself? And it turns out that, when you, the wonderful saying is that when you forgive someone, you set yourself free, but you're also setting them free as well, right? Anyone who's been in that position of unforgiveness knows that it's a prison to live in. And when you have someone that forgives you, oh my gosh, you set them free in an amazing way. So that's some more of the science of we. The other really fascinating and exciting things that we've got going on, some of our impact projects, which I am a part of, are this academic flourishing initiative. We have a survey that we've created that is unique to the university's contribution to the notion of flourishing. So it's essentially, if you ask a student, not, are you happy with your university experience? The question we would ask is, to what extent has the university helped you to think more clearly? To what extent has the university prepared you to make a meaningful difference in the world? And so this is a mirror back to the universities. We, being here at Harvard, are really interested in the quality of higher education. One of the pathways to a flourishing life is education. And so, we know that the importance of good education is vital. So that's something we're working on. We work with K-12 schools to improve the idea of flourishing in schools. That's in particular invokes a lot of character work. And so we're very interested in measuring character. The VIA Character Institute is a collaborator and a partner of ours that we work on research with. And so we measure character, promote character through education. Right now, we have a fascinating new project around artificial intelligence and human flourishing. AI is a massive sort of revolution in terms of technology and what this is going to mean for us as a species. And so we're asking questions of what are the fundamental things that can't be can't be replaced or substituted as it relates to how we use new technologies, in particular, something that seems to align so closely to human consciousness. So we're doing a lot of different things at the program.
Wow. That was an amazing.
Sorry, I rambled there for a little while.
No.
I really got on to forgiveness.
No, the reason I paused is I was going to jest about y'all really need to get off the couch and start to, do something with all of this. But that's definitely happening. I mean, I think the reason why I paused is because a lot of the time in my kind of windy career path and the different, projects I'm a part of, I find that there is often missing this connective tissue between researchers, institutions that publish it in a paper and they're like, peace, done. And
yeah.
I often end up picking up said research, translating it, whether it's for our students in the university context or Fortune 150 clients that I work with, where I'm often, in that spot of developing learning experience design, for the purpose of some sort of flourishing within the organization or whatnot. And so it really strikes me that there is a different sense, and I don't know if it's from the original collaborators or if it's part of the value of the I and we and all of that, but it really strikes me as different the way that you're approaching impact in that translation. I mean, maybe this is specific to your role in leading the impact work. Do you think about the intentionality of getting it from that really high quality, rigorous research that is, to your point, hasn't been done before like this, into the practicality of policy? How do you think about that imperative?
Absolutely. Yeah, well, actually, this is a really fun question because part of my time as a research assistant for Arthur Brooks at the Harvard Kennedy School was working on a portfolio of work, doing more research around social impact ventures. So there's a nonprofit management and leadership course at the Kennedy School for which there's all sorts of resources one could find about this. And it turns out that nonprofits and social impact ventures can be as transformative, if not more, to the world and to society than traditional business. Businesses, of course, are the mainstay. They affect our lives the most. But there are things that they can't do that social impact organizations can, that research organizations can. And the way you approach that is somewhat different. So typical entrepreneurship, a lot of people reduce entrepreneurship to sort of the brick and mortar idea of, starting a coffee shop off of Main Street. And by the way, that's one of my dreams in life to do, but entrepreneurship is a lot more than that, right? One might be familiar with the term intrapreneurship, which is, solving something new or coming up with something new within an established system, which is what we're doing here at Harvard. Harvard is 400 years old, America's oldest public interest organization, and we're building something new within it. And so we call that intrapreneurship. So impact, what does that mean in terms of sort of a science? I think that when I approach this topic, it's unfortunate people might roll their eyes at the semantics of it, but you're approaching this very nebulous term, as you kind of want to almost give it like a counter definition. So when you think about the idea of leadership, people use it colloquially all the time. Leadership can be studied, is studied by our wonderful colleagues at the Harvard Business School, or we could just use it colloquially as a leader. The irreducible sort of factor for leadership, the thing that you can't have, you can't really define leadership without, is influence. You don't have influence over another person, and I don't mean over as in like you need to dominate them, but if you don't influence them, change the way that they think, or if you can't lead them, if they're not interested in following you, if you don't have some degree of influence, you really don't have leadership. Impact, when I think about what does it mean to have impact in society, you can't really have impact unless you have persuasion, unless you are persuasive. So when we talk about impact, we talk about applied research, stakeholder transformation, and communications. It's kind of the natural byline that when people are asking me what my title is, it's like these are the things I focus on. When we're really thinking about impact, what we would love to do is to be able to change people's minds. The reason you want to change people's minds is because once you change a person's mind, you change their expectation. And when you change their expectation, they demand something different. And so what I mean by that is, let's say that you are going to you're looking to improve your life, and you're feeling stuck, like we talked about before, and you go to the self-help section of a bookstore, and the question that you might have in your mind is, which book am I going to choose? We've done years and years of scientific research. I would hope that by this time we've persuaded you that you should be looking for something that's a little bit more intellectually rigorous, right? That's that you have genuinely changed people's expectations and what they demand based on how persuasive you are. Now, if we're going back to that, sort of liberal arts education, the ancient Greeks thought about persuasion in three ways: the logos, the pathos, and the ethos. And it's very self-explanatory. Logos is logic, right? When we as a program focus a lot on research. I mean, our founder has over 500 publications. I mean, it's just absurd how much. Like, we just kind of come down and it's almost like bludgeoning people over the heads when we have so much research, right? But that's not like, that's one way of persuading people. Pathos is passion, it's emotion, and flourishing is a really great place to start with that, because it's like, look, when you have kids whose futures you care about, it's like I'm interested in developing their character because I love my child, and so we're going to focus in ways of improving people's lives genuinely, authentically, through forgiveness, through character education. So we're going to focus on this. Then the last one is ethos. And I think about this as really building a culture of credibility, which is that if we're focused on good research, we're focused on meeting people where they're at and connecting with them emotionally. But the last piece is that, what do I mean by building a culture of credibility? It means that when we go into any institution, we can have a good design match fit. One of the things that academia is really good at doing is building things that nobody asked for, right? We'll go to, it might be, Georgia Tech, MIT, Harvard, Dartmouth, anywhere. You find this research project. You're like, who in the world started this thing? How does it relate to anything? Getting tenure is becoming an expert in something no one knows about. So oftentimes, what we're really looking to do is actually kind of meet market demand. But by building that culture of credibility, it's to say, look, we understand what the needs are, and so we're going to take the research and match it. We're not going to show up. There's this great saying that if the only tool you have is a hammer, then all the world becomes a nail, right? And so we don't want to approach every room, but all we have is research, and that's all that we can do is just bludgeon people over the head over research. That's not what we're trying to do. And so this is why cognitive behavioral therapy is really important. These workshops are important. Finding novel ways. What a workbook is not necessarily what anyone might have conceived of as being a really, good thing to do to help people with forgiveness. These are the sorts of things that we focus on. And so again, that ethos, pathos, logos, all of those things is really about not only changing people's minds, but changing their expectations. Because once you've changed people's expectations, they demand something different. They demand a different product. They demand a different government. They demand a different morning routine. All of those sorts of things is that, look, that's what drives, behavior. That's what has genuine impact.
One of the things that strikes me about that is then it becomes like a pull versus a push, that they're demanding something to become different, which then when I think of these large systems, a lot of times my space is either in education space or within like large organizations that have deeply entrenched cultures similar to education. And we kept saying, especially in the education space, oh, like when COVID happened, everything's going to change. And then it went back to the same. When this happens, then it's going to change. But I think what's striking me here is this idea of it coming from that, like the end user demanding the system be different because they recognize there's maybe a different need in this space that we've been talking about to help our children flourish, or to help a university student flourish, or an employee within a large organization, or an entrepreneur. The first piece of that is recognizing like what the research is essentially saying, no matter what the modality is of them accessing it, but having that, being able to notice and name, this is what I need that's different, and then demanding that from the market is a really interesting way to think about it.
Well, and I do want to qualify that, I don't want to be mislead anyone into thinking that we let demand drive our research. I think we have an excellent team of scientists who go into a hypothesis as a question. That question shouldn't have too many. Every hypothesis has some assumptions, but it shouldn't have too many assumptions. And you go out and research, you get the data, and you let the data speak for itself.
Right.
And this is exactly what we saw with the Global Flourishing Study, which was, we didn't predict this list. And we never predicted that Indonesia would be, the highest composite flourishing score. But you do need to let the data speak for itself. But then it reveals where the demand is, right?
Right.
It really
then
reveals,
what do you do with it?
Kids, hey, we got to look after the younger generation because look what's happening. You see what I
Yes,
think.
yes. We asked this question. It's a sentence stem. What would you say if only people knew?
Boy, if there was one thing across all of it, if only people knew that love was accessible to them and that love was a pathway to flourishing. One project we didn't talk about is that we're piloting a lot of research around love. And this is a topic that is, if you pick up any book sort of in the positive psychology, well-being, happiness, spirituality space, you're going to find the topic of love. The late George Valiant of the Harvard Adult Study of Development tried to reduce everything down to happiness is love, full stop. I think, we know so much now about how important social connection is, and connection is in general, to brain development, to child development, to forgiving enemies, to social cohesion, is connection. And connection, we as human beings are not wired for vapid connection. We're not wired to have 20,000 LinkedIn followers and no friends. That's not a good situation to be in, right? That's not what we were evolved or designed for. But I would think that if I could tell one person anything, or if only people knew that there's actually an eagerness, there is an intrinsic desire to experience love, and that it has a sort of a melting effect of the hardness that we experience both in society, but also as individuals. And I would think that actually, that sounds so fluffy and not maybe what you would expect as my answer, but I think like that is the through line sort of across every single one of these projects that we're doing. So if only people knew that.
Reece, I just want to thank you so much for coming on, for diving into that, taking us into the research, coming back, like pulling out of that to let us kind of make sense of it and ask non-researchy questions too along the way. It's been such a powerful conversation that I think our listeners will get so much out of. And I look forward to staying connected and hearing more about the work that you all are doing.
Well, genuinely appreciate the opportunity to come on. God bless you. God bless all the people who are listening. Thanks for letting me share. And yeah, I'm looking forward to staying in touch.
Thank you so much for listening to the Building Thinkers podcast. If you enjoyed our episode today and all of the insights that Reece shared, please give us a 5-star rating and review. That's where other folks are able to find our podcast. It helps us in the podcast algorithm land. So we really appreciate that and look forward to listening in next time.